Nobody in that sterile, white-tiled hospital expected a world-renowned surgeon like Dr. Adrian Vale to lose his composure. But the moment Adrian stepped into the hallway, adjusting his stethoscope and mentally rehearsing his pitch for the elite medical board, he froze. Just 3 doors down from his private office, slumped on a plastic waiting chair, was a man who looked like he'd crawled out of a nightmare. Rowan Blackwood was rugged, disheveled, and visibly exhausted, his faded denim shirt caked in a layer of grime that seemed to offend the very air of the prestigious facility. He sat with a downcast expression, dirty hands clutching a rag, moving with a hollow weariness as if every breath was a struggle. A head nurse, checking her clipboard with clinical coldness, barked at an orderly loud enough for the entire corridor to hear. If he can't pay the intake fee, move him to the public clinic sidewalk. Patient or not, we have a reputation to maintain. Rowan didn't argue. He didn't look up. He just looked defeated. Adrian stood so still his breath hitched. His colleagues stared, waiting for him to lead the morning rounds, but the hallway went quiet. "Rowan," Adrian said, the name tasting like a 15-year-old ghost. The man on the bench didn't smile. He didn't cry. He only whispered, "Please, just let me disappear." And that's when the fluorescent light hit the side of Rowan's neck. Adrian noticed a distinctive, trident-shaped mark etched into the skin, a mark he'd seen every day of his childhood. His voice dropped to a razor-thin line, trembling with a question he thought was buried in a lab explosion a decade and a half ago. "Is it really you?" Rowan's eyes flicked to the medical staff, pretending not to stare. He swallowed hard, forcing his face into something flat and careful. "Doctor," he said, his voice barely above a breath. "Don't do this." The morning sun filtered through the high, arched windows of St. Jude's Medical Center, casting sharp, clinical lines across the polished marble. Dr. Adrian Vale adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, his movements as precise as the surgical incisions that had made him famous. He was less than an hour away from his final interview with the elite medical board, a milestone that would cement his legacy as a titan of unemotional efficiency. To Adrian, a hospital was a machine of logic, and today, everything had to be perfect. But the machine had a glitch. As Adrian turned the corner toward his private office, he stopped. The sterile scent of antiseptic was masked by a heavy, earthy musk that didn't belong here. Slumped on a plastic waiting chair, amidst the gleaming equipment and hushed staff, was a man who looked like an affront to the hospital's prestige. Rowan Blackwood sat with his head low, his lean frame worn down by a fatigue that seemed to go deeper than skin. His faded blue denim shirt was caked with grime and torn at the shoulder, revealing skin that was equally weathered. His hands, rough and stained with dirt, clutched a tattered rag. He was a jagged shard of glass in Adrian's pristine world. Head nurse Sarah Miller approached Adrian, her face tight with professional annoyance. "Doctor, he's been here for 20 minutes. No ID, no insurance, and he refuses to speak to the intake staff. He's making the other patients uncomfortable." Adrian looked down at Rowan. He didn't see a human being in pain. He saw a resource drain, a mess that needed to be cleared before the board members arrived. "This is a private surgical facility, not a homeless shelter," Adrian said, his voice cold and resonant. "He's a liability. If he can't produce a form of payment or a valid emergency, move him to the public clinic sidewalk immediately." I just need a moment," Rowan whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't look up, his downcast expression fixed on his trembling hands. "Hospital policy is clear, Sarah," Adrian continued, his tone final. "We have a reputation to maintain. If he's still here in 5 minutes, call security. Patient or not, he is a disruption we cannot afford." Adrian began to turn away, his mind already shifting back to his board presentation. He had spent 15 years burying his past in work, building a life where numbers don't betray you, and human messiness was something to be managed, not felt. He took a single step toward his office, the click of his expensive shoes echoing with finality. He was ready to let this man be erased from his sight, just another dirty patient who didn't fit the balance sheet. He didn't know that the next few seconds were about to dismantle the very empire he had sacrificed his soul to build. Adrian was already 2 steps toward the boardroom when a flicker of movement caught his eye. Nurse Miller had reached out to grab Rowan's shoulder, intending to guide him toward the exit, but the man flinched violently. As Rowan recoiled, his head snapped to the side, and the harsh, clinical glare of the overhead fluorescent lights hit his neck with the precision of a spotlight. Adrian stopped dead. The air in his lungs suddenly felt like concrete. There, etched in dark, jagged red against the pale skin behind Rowan's ear, was a trident-shaped birthmark. It wasn't just a mark, it was a ghost. Adrian's hand went to the wall to steady himself as the sterile hallway of St. Jude began to dissolve into a memory of a smoke-filled laboratory 15 years ago. He remembered that exact mark on a young boy's neck, a boy who had been laughing moments before the floor fell away in a bloom of fire and twisted steel. "Stop," Adrian commanded, his voice no longer cold and surgical but fractured and raw. Nurse Miller froze, her hand hovering in midair. The orderly paused. The entire corridor seemed to hold its breath. Adrian walked back toward the bench, his expensive shoes feeling heavy, as if he were walking through deep water. He reached out, his fingers trembling, a weakness he had never allowed himself in a decade of surgery, and gently tilted Rowan's chin upward. Rowan tried to pull away, his eyes wide with a frantic, animal-like panic, but as Adrian's eyes locked onto the trident mark, the world narrowed until it was just the 2 of them. It was unmistakable. This wasn't a tattoo or a scar from the dirty life Rowan had been living. It was the biological signature of the Vale family. "Rowan," Adrian whispered, the name catching in his throat like a shard of glass. The man on the bench finally looked up, and for the first time, Adrian saw past the grime and the stubble. He saw the familiar shape of the jawline and the deep, haunted blue of eyes that matched his own. The outcast he had just ordered to be thrown onto the sidewalk wasn't a stranger. He was the brother Adrian had spent 15 years mourning, the brother he had convinced himself was dead so that he could move on to a life of hollow success. Rowan's lips parted, a small broken sound escaping them. "Adrian, you weren't supposed to see me." The clipboard slipped from Nurse Miller's hand, clattering against the marble floor, but Adrian didn't hear it. He was looking at the dirt on his brother's denim shirt and realizing that the disruption he had feared wasn't Rowan, it was the truth. His world of clinical perfection had just been shattered by a birthmark that proved his entire life was built on a lie. The chaos of the main corridor suddenly felt like a distant roar as Adrian took command, his medical mask dropping into place as he reverted to the cold, authoritative tone that usually silenced any dissent. He didn't explain. He didn't justify. He simply ordered a gurney and navigated Rowan away from the prying eyes of the staff and the high-definition security cameras of the main surgical wing. He led the way toward the north wing, a restricted, decommissioned research sector currently under renovation, where the air was thick with the scent of dust and silence. Once inside the dimly lit laboratory suite, Adrian kicked the door shut and engaged the manual deadbolt. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered to life, buzzing with a nervous energy that matched the pounding in Adrian's chest. He helped Rowan onto a stainless steel examination table, the metal groaning under the weight of a man who looked like he had been carrying the world on his shoulders. "Adrian," Rowan rasped, his eyes darting toward the frosted glass of the door. "You shouldn't have. They'll come for me here." "Let them," Adrian snapped, though his hands shook as he snapped on a pair of latex gloves. "Nobody enters this wing without my biometric bypass." He turned his attention to the dirt he had so arrogantly dismissed minutes ago. Up close, under the focused beam of a surgical lamp, the grime on Rowan's denim shirt and skin didn't look like common mud or street filth. It had a strange, iridescent sheen, a metallic gray-blue hue that seemed to cling to the fibers of the fabric like a parasite. Adrian took a sterile swab, dragging it across the sleeve of Rowan's shirt. As he dropped the sample into a chemical reagent, the solution didn't turn brown. It hissed, turning a violent, glowing violet. Adrian's breath hitched. This wasn't dirt. It was a synthetic compound, a highly specialized neuroconductive gel used only in advanced and largely illegal deep brain stimulation trials. His eyes drifted to Rowan's hands. The grime under the fingernails was actually chemical carbon staining, the kind of marking left by prolonged contact with high-voltage electrodes. "Rowan," Adrian whispered, his voice cracking as the realization settled into his bones. "This is experimental residue. You weren't living on the streets. You were being kept in a lab." Rowan looked away, a single tear cutting a clean path through the synthetic soot on his cheek. "I wasn't a guest, Adrian. I was a serial number." Adrian looked at the trident birthmark again, now partially obscured by a fresh smear of the violet-tinted gel. The brother he had mourned hadn't died in an accident. He had been harvested by the very industry Adrian had spent 15 years worshipping. The clinical perfection Adrian lived for was the same monster that had turned his brother into a broken test subject. Rowan's eyes remained fixed on the chemical-stained swab, his breathing shallow and jagged, like the sound of rusted machinery. He looked less like a man and more like a relic of a disaster that Adrian had spent a decade and a half trying to scrub from his memory. For 15 years, Adrian had lived with the image of a collapsing ceiling and a roar of fire that had supposedly consumed his younger brother. He had built a life of steel and glass on top of that grave, convincing himself that grief was simply a variable to be managed. "I watched the building burn, Rowan," Adrian whispered, his voice cracking as he leaned over the examination table. "I stood at the perimeter and watched the search teams come out with nothing. They told me the heat was so intense there was nothing left to find. I buried an empty casket." Rowan finally looked up, and the raw agony in his gaze was sharper than any surgical blade Adrian had ever held. "They wanted you to bury it," Rowan rasped, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. "The fire wasn't an accident, Adrian. It was a curtain." Adrian's hands went still. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't die in the lab," Rowan said, the words spilling out in a frantic, terrifying rush. "I was in the ventilation shaft when the first explosion hit. I was alive, screaming for you, but I wasn't found by the firemen. I was found by men in suits, men who knew exactly who we were and what our father was developing." He reached up, his dirty, rough fingers trembling as they touched the trident birthmark on his neck. "They didn't want the research. They wanted the biological data. They knew the Vale bloodline was the only one that could stabilize the neural interface. They stole me from the rubble while you were being treated for smoke inhalation. They fed you a death certificate and fed me to a machine." Adrian felt a cold, sickening dread settle in his stomach. He thought of the prestigious awards on his office wall and the unemotional efficiency he prided himself on. While he was climbing the corporate medical ladder, his brother had been a ghost, a serial number in a black site facility. 15 years, Rowan choked out, a single tear cutting through the grime on his face. 15 years of being a ghost in a cage. "I didn't die that day, Adrian. I just stopped being a person." Adrian reached out, tentatively placing a gloved hand on his brother's scarred arm. The dirty patient he had tried to throw out wasn't a stranger. He was a living testimony to Adrian's greatest failure. The ghost had returned, and it was covered in the soot of a 15-year-old lie. The silence in the restricted wing was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the diagnostic equipment Adrian had used to scan Rowan's vitals. As his brother drifted into a fitful, exhausted sleep, Adrian retreated to a shadowed corner of the lab, his tablet glowing with a harsh blue light. He bypassed 2 layers of hospital security to access the deep donor archives of St. Jude's, a ledger of names that usually represented prestige and progress. His fingers moved with surgical precision, tracing the patent numbers associated with the neuroconductive gel he had found on Rowan's skin. The search led him away from medical journals and into the murky waters of offshore shell companies. He cross-referenced the chemical signatures with a project titled Prometheus 9, a shuttered neurological study that had allegedly been abandoned after a catastrophic fire 15 years ago. Adrian felt a cold sweat prickle his neck as a familiar logo appeared on the screen, Medcore Industries. He recognized the name immediately. They were the primary benefactors of the hospital's new neurological research wing, the very wing Adrian was set to lead. Heart hammering against his ribs, he dug deeper into the board of directors for Medcore. He didn't find strangers. He found the faces of the men who had shook his hand at the hospital's gala last month. These were the philanthropists who had donated $50 million to St. Jude, under the condition of discretionary research freedom. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The prestigious career he had built, the very hospital walls he stood within, were funded by the men who had turned his brother into a ghost. Medcorp hadn't just stolen Rowan from the rubble. They had been using Adrian's own hospital as a front to wash the data they extracted from their illegal test subjects. Adrian looked through the frosted glass toward the main hallway, where his colleagues were preparing for the board meeting. He had spent his life chasing their approval, never realizing he was being groomed to oversee the very experiments that had tortured his kin. The philanthropy he admired was actually the payment for Rowan's silence. He turned back to the sleeping figure on the table. Rowan's rugged, scarred face was a map of the suffering Adrian's donors had paid for. The pristine, charcoal suit Adrian wore suddenly felt like a uniform of the enemy. He wasn't just a doctor anymore. He was a man standing inside a trap built by the people he had trusted most. The conspiracy didn't live in a distant black site. It was poolsing in the very heart of the hospital he called home. Adrian stood by the narrow window of the decommissioned lab, watching the shadow of a security patrol pass by the frosted glass. He looked back at Rowan, who was shivering despite the thermal blanket. The dirty appearance that had initially repulsed Adrian now demanded a closer, more clinical inspection. He began to cut away the tattered denim shirt, and as the fabric fell away, the true cost of Rowan's journey was laid bare. It wasn't just grime. Rowan's skin was a map of raw, weeping abrasions and deep, jagged lacerations that traced the length of his forearms and shins. The dirt was a mixture of industrial grease, stagnant water, and rust. Adrian noticed the specific pattern of the bruising on Rowan's shoulders, the kind caused by squeezing through impossibly tight, unforgiving spaces. "How did you get out, Rowan?" Adrian asked, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "The Medcorp facility is in the valley, 10 miles from here." Rowan's eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. "I knew the schematics from the sessions," he rasped, his breath hitching in pain. "They have an old industrial waste line. It runs beneath the ridge right into the city's utility veins. I waited for the shift change. I didn't walk, Adrian, I crawled." Adrian's chest tightened. He knew those utility veins, miles of narrow, rusted pipes and concrete overflow tunnels, slick with chemical runoff and freezing water. To reach this hospital, Rowan had dragged his body through 10 miles of darkness, navigating by touch and memory, driven by a singular, desperate hope. "You did all that, for me. You were the only one left who knew my name," Rowan whispered. "I couldn't die as a number. I had to get to the one place they couldn't touch me without making a scene. I had to find the man in the charcoal suit." Adrian looked down at his own clean, manicured hands and felt a wave of profound shame. He had been worried about his reputation, and the set of his tie while his brother was tearing his skin against rusted iron, dragging himself through the filth of the earth just to see a face he recognized. The dirty patient wasn't a vagrant. He was a survivor who had performed a miraculous feat of endurance to reach the only person he believed could save him. Rowan hadn't just escaped a lab. He had clawed his way back from the grave, and the dirt he carried was the holy evidence of his will to live. Adrian reached for a basin of sterile water. As he began to gently wash away the industrial grease, he realized that every layer of filth he removed was a layer of his own arrogance being stripped away. The surgeon was no longer preparing for a board meeting. He was finally learning what it meant to be a doctor. The heavy silence of the restricted wing was shattered by the rhythmic, metallic chime of Adrian's encrypted pager. It was a high-priority alert from the hospital lobby, not for a medical emergency, but for a security inquiry regarding a missing asset. Adrian looked at the screen, his blood turning to ice. Medcorp had tracked the trail of industrial grease and chemical residue right to his doorstep. He looked at Rowan, who had curled into a defensive ball on the examination table, his eyes wide with a terror that no amount of sedative could dull. "They're here," Rowan whispered, the sound a ragged plea. Adrian didn't hesitate. He stripped off his latex gloves and straightened the lapels of his charcoal suit, the fabric feeling like a lead weight against his chest. He checked the biometric lock on the lab door, ensuring his brother was sealed inside a fortress of decommissioned steel. "Don't make a sound," Adrian commanded, his voice regaining its surgical edge. "I'm ending this now." As the elevator doors opened into the main lobby, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. 3 men stood near the reception desk, their presence an aggressive stain on the hospital's polished aesthetic. They wore tailored black suits that lacked the warmth of medical attire, and their eyes were as hollow as the corporate ledgers Adrian had uncovered. In the center stood Marcus Thorne, the chief of security for MedCorp, the same man who had stood beside Adrian at last month's fundraiser. "Dr. Vale," Thorne said, his voice a smooth, dangerous baritone. "We're looking for a vagrant, a trespasser who broke into one of our specialized research facilities this morning. We followed the trail here." Adrian felt the eyes of the hospital staff on him, the nurses who admired him, the juniors who feared him, and the board members who were currently waiting in the conference room to hand him his future. He stood at the center of the marble floor, the embodiment of success, wealth, and clinical perfection. Thorne took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Don't let a dirty runaway ruin the career we've built for you, Adrian. Just tell us which room he's in, and this all stays quiet. Your seat on the board is waiting." Adrian looked at Thorne, then at the elevator that led back to the ghost with the trident birthmark. He realized that for 15 years, he had been wearing this charcoal suit as a shroud, hiding from the truth of his own cowardice. "There is no vagrant here," Adrian said, his voice echoing with a finality that silenced the room. Thorne's expression darkened. "Think carefully, Doctor. You're choosing a ghost over a kingdom." "I'm choosing a brother over a monster," Adrian replied, stepping directly into Thorne's path, his shadow falling long and defiant across the hospital logo. The elite surgeon was gone. In his place stood a man ready to burn his kingdom to the ground to keep his brother warm. Thorne's eyes were narrowed into predatory slits, his hand twitching toward the encrypted radio at his belt. "You're making a career-ending mistake, Adrian," he hissed, the threat vibrating in the air between them. But Adrian didn't flinch. He turned his back on the MedCorp security team, his stride purposeful as he moved toward the nursing station. He had only minutes before Thorne stopped playing by the rules of hospital etiquette. "Nurse Miller," Adrian said, his voice projecting a calm, clinical authority that masked the thunder of his heart. "The patient in the restricted wing has a highly contagious, unidentified neurological pathogen. I'm declaring a localized level 4 quarantine for the North Wing immediately." The nurses froze. In a hospital, that specific sequence of words was a command that overrode everything, including the board's schedule. "Clear the service elevator and the basement freight bay," Adrian continued, scribbling a rapid-fire series of emergency transfer orders on a digital pad. "I'm personally escorting the subject to a containment vehicle. No one, and I mean no one, comes within 10 feet of the gurney without my direct authorization." Thorne and his men tried to move toward the elevators, but the hospital's automated protocols were already engaging. Yellow lights flashed, and security shutters began to descend. By the time Thorne realized the quarantine was a smokescreen, Adrian was already back in the restricted lab. He didn't waste time with words. He helped Rowan into a generic hospital gown and draped a heavy sterile sheet over him, obscuring the rugged denim and the grime of his escape. He pushed the gurney into the service elevator, the metal walls rattling as they descended toward the belly of the building. "Stay still," Adrian whispered, his hand gripping the railing of the gurney until his knuckles turned white. "We're almost out." The elevator doors opened to the loading docks, where a private ambulance Adrian had summoned through a personal contact sat idling. The driver, an old friend from residency who owed Adrian a life debt, kept the engine running. As they rolled the gurney into the back of the vehicle, Adrian looked up to see Thorne and his team burst through the basement doors, their faces contorted with rage. Adrian didn't wait. He climbed into the back beside his brother and slammed the doors shut. As the ambulance tore out of the bay, the sirens wailing a defiant scream against the night, Adrian looked down at his charcoal suit. It was wrinkled, stained with the violet chemical residue from Rowan's skin and utterly ruined. He reached out and took his brother's hand, rough, dirty, and trembling. For the first time in 15 years, Adrian didn't care about his reputation, his seat on the board, or the unemotional efficiency that had defined him. He was no longer the world-renowned surgeon of St. Jude. He was just a man who had stolen his brother back from the dead. 6 months later, the morning sun didn't hit marble floors or chandelier-lit lobbies. Instead, it filtered through the modest windows of a renovated storefront in one of the city's forgotten districts. There were no board members waiting for a pitch, and no charcoal suits to be found. Adrian stood in the center of the small clinic, wearing a simple pair of scrubs that bore no prestigious hospital logo. His hands, once obsessed with the unemotional efficiency of elite surgery, were now busy prepping a station for a young mother who couldn't afford the intake fees at St. Jude. Across the room, Rowan was moving with a steady, quiet strength. The grime of his 10-mile crawl through the earth was gone, replaced by the healthy glow of a man who was finally breathing clean air. He wasn't a serial number or a dirty patient anymore. He was the clinic's head of outreach, the bridge between the medical world and the people who lived in its shadows. The trident birthmark on his neck was still there, no longer a hidden scar of a corporate conspiracy, but a badge of a history they both finally acknowledged. Adrian's departure from the high-end medical world had been explosive. The lawsuit against Medcor had stripped him of his elite status and emptied his bank accounts. But as he looked at the line of people waiting outside his door, he felt a wealth that numbers couldn't calculate. He had traded his kingdom for a soul, and the bargain felt lighter every day. Rowan walked over, leaning against the counter. "You missed the board meeting this morning, Doctor," he joked, though his eyes were warm with a deep, shared understanding. Adrian smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes, a look his former colleagues wouldn't have recognized. "I think I'm exactly where I need to be." He looked at the small sign hanging in the window, Vale Community Health. It wasn't a showroom for the rich or a front for a dark experiment. It was a place where people were seen before they were diagnosed. Adrian had learned the hardest lesson of his life. Compassion isn't a weakness that complicates a career. It is the only thing that makes the work worth doing. As he called the first patient forward, he didn't check his watch or worry about his reputation. He simply listened. He stood beside the brother he had once mourned, realizing that while he had saved Rowan from the lab, Rowan had saved him from a life of cold, hollow perfection. They were no longer ghosts of a 15-year-old fire. They were finally, for the first time in their lives, whole.